Welcome, friends, to Breakfast in the Ruins, a Michael Moorcock flavoured podcast. It's Easter Monday, 2026, so what better day to send out some musings on the late 60s Moorcock classic, Behold the Man. I've been building up to this for a while, and this will no doubt be a multi-part endeavour, but I was really delighted to be able to kick off festivities with a chat with Professor Rowland Wymer. Patron Nick Hopkinson sent me a link to Rowley's article in Volume 52, Number 2 of the Interdisciplinary critical journal Mosaic from June 2019, titled The Imitation of Christ, Michael Moorcock's Behold the Man. Rowley is Emeritus Professor of English in the Department of English and Media at Anglia Ruskin University, Cambridge, and he has a long association with all things science fiction, including introducing and teaching science fiction text to his English students for the past 30-odd years. After devouring his article, I dropped him a line to invite him to D&Ts, and here we are. Most Moorcock fans will know Behold the Man, and most of those will be aware that it comes in two forms: the 1966 novella that appeared in New Worlds and the expanded novel published in 1969. For those listeners that haven't come across it, Rowley summarises the core conceit of the novel in his article, where he says, Moorcock's deeply uncomfortable and arguably blasphemous story concerns a time travel from the 1970s. An unhappy young Jew from North London called Karl Glogauer, who seeks to solve his many psychological problems by returning to Palestine in AD 28 to seek out the historical Jesus in the year before the presumed date of his crucifixion. Essential fodder for any young sci-fi fan then, like me, when I got the Fontana edition off Pops back in the 80s. The novella won the 1967 Nebula Award, and the novel has gone on to be widely considered as one of Mike's most important works. It was controversial, as one may expect when you consider the subject matter, but writing 30 years later in the afterword of the 30th anniversary edition, published in 1996 by Mojo Press, Mike was circumspect when he wrote, In this story, I did not at any stage set out to shock or to upset anyone. I was examining an idea. My understanding of Christianity was that this was a perfectly acceptable and even reverent examination. I had not come to realise in those days that while many were talking religion, they were actually meaning political zealotry. I thought I had been taking part in an ongoing debate. It was only the murderous ferocity of my correspondence which made me at last understand that I had committed a capital crime. For everyone who wrote and offered the opinion that I should be killed or otherwise severely punished for writing the story, I returned the purchase price of their copy plus their postage. It has always seemed the fairest way to treat dissatisfied customers. That principle, however, is waived for expensive limited editions. The first edition of the book was not published in England as SF. It received sympathetic reviews in the literary and religious press, and it also went down well in the SF community. It appeared in the same year as The Mad God's Amulet, The Rune Staff, The Ice Schooner, The Black Corridor, and The Final Programme, all of which had very different levels of ambition. Their disparity confused some people. If these days it continues to confuse them, then it's probably the best I can hope for. So, if you're easily offended by blasphemous sci-fi, maybe park up at the door. Otherwise, join us in our milky globe as we take our first look at Behold the Man. Well, we're back in Derry Toms, and I'm delighted to have with me Professor Rowland Wymer, Emeritus Professor of English, member of the British Science Fiction Association, member of the Centre for Science Fiction and Fantasy. Welcome, Rowley. It's an absolute delight to have you on the podcast.
Well, thanks very much for inviting me. I look forward to talking about Moorcock.
Well, it's funny, isn't it? Because the reason I came across your name was that one of our friends pointed out a paper that you'd written, a critique, which we'll get to in short order. But we have a usual preamble on the show whenever we have a new guest, and that is to ask, what is your history with genre fiction and Moorcock in particular?
Okay, well, I, like a lot of people, I started reading science fiction about the age of 12, I think. Yeah. This was because the son of a neighbour of ours lent me those Brian Aldiss Penguin science fiction anthologies of short stories.
Yeah.
And I was really hooked by those immediately and started, I read a lot generally anyway, but I started reading science fiction as well as all the other stuff I read, and really never lost that enthusiasm for the genre, even though my main professional work was in Renaissance drama and Shakespeare and so on.
But you have also specific research interests around science fiction, don't you? And film. I noticed it said including the films of Derek Jarman on the faculty page on Anglia Ruskin University.
I've written on quite a wide variety of things. But, the science fiction academic side didn't really develop much till quite later on because I had all sorts of other things to do first. But I think the first SF article I wrote was on John Wyndham in about 1992, I think. And then there was another long pause, and then I started writing more on science fiction in the 21st century. So I've written on Mary Dory Russell, James Blish, J.G. Ballard, and the reason that you've invited me onto this on Michael Moorcock's Behold the Man.
Yeah. How old were you when you read it?
How old was I? I think I was about 20. Actually, I don't think I read the shorter version when it first came out. I think I first read the longer version just after that first came out.
Yeah.
So that came out in 1969. And I remember reading it not that long after and being, very impressed by it. And I was actually, I remember discussing it with her. I was in a shared house in 71, 72 with 6 other people. And I was enthusiastically waving this at them and getting them all to read it. I have to say, most of them were not very impressed by it. And I was, not all of them, there was one or two liked it, but I was being told it wasn't very well written. And I was saying, well, I'm the one doing an English degree, and I'm telling you it is well written.
You know what? This is one of the criticism Moorcock gets from... There's a modern habit, isn't there? I've seen it numerous times. There was a book review programme on the TV a couple of years ago that started up. I don't even know if it's still on. But Jo Brand was on it, and she was saying, yes, I like literary detective novels. And I remember almost shouting fuck off at the telly, because just say you like detective novels. Why do you have to preface it with literary? And there's a portion of the sci-fi and fantasy community that like their doorstop books, and if it's 130 pages long, it can't be worthy, And I think Moorcock gets a lot of stick from some of those areas because he is extraordinary. I mean, let's face it, he was writing these things in 3 days in the late 60s. Nevertheless, he was writing extraordinarily brisk, pacey, well-constructed adventure fiction. But when it comes to... I read Behold the Man, I think, for the first time when I was like 13 or something. One of the big things about this podcast is one of the reasons why I even talk about these books or think about them is because my granddad, who we call Pops, used to just... His coffee table would have his pipe, his ashtray, his rocking chair next to it, and a little pile of paperbacks, and it was always fantasy and science fiction, mass market paperbacks from the 60s and 70s. And Behold the Man was one of those books I picked up when I was 12 or 13. Seemed extraordinarily naughty to a 13-year-old.
So I would have thought it should have had at least a 15 certificate on it.
Yeah. But at the time, most of that will have flown over my head. As a randy 13-year-old, I will have got the stuff about boobs and crucifixes between cleavage and all that kind of thing. But yeah, I mean, it seemed extraordinarily naughty. But even then, I think myself and some of my friends, we were getting deeply into Moorcock, and the Bob Haberfield covers were blowing our minds and everything else. So yeah, I mean, Behold the Man, I can remember handing Moorcock books out to people and getting varied responses, varied responses.
Yeah. I think this was the original edition
Yes, the Haberfield cover.
It's got a very, impressive allusion to Dali's Christ of St. John of the Cross painting, and it's a really compelling cover.
Well, a few years ago, we had Bob Haberfield's son on the podcast. Sadly, we were too late to talk to Bob because he passed away about a year earlier, but we had Bob's son on, and we had a fantastic conversation with him and about his beliefs and his spiritual journey with things like Buddhism, and incredibly interesting bloke, Bob Haberfield. And interestingly enough, from the Bob Haberfield web shop, you can now get prints of his covers in really, really high quality, framed as well, which is nice. So I've actually got the covers from The Eternal Champion and the Knight of the Swords. Yeah, Knight of the Swords in our kitchen because I have an extremely forgiving wife. She doesn't mind me putting these things up.
I'd certainly be interested in the Behold the Man cover if there was a print of that. I'll have a look.
I'm got to revisit the web shop and see if because he's been going through them in waves because he's still got most, if not all, of the original paintings because his dad had his studio was in Wales. And he had a house there, and the vast majority of these paintings he still had just kicking around in cupboards. Just incredible, really. What a treasure trove. But anyway, yes, Behold the Man. So there's something else we need to talk about as well. Before joining Anglia Ruskin in 2004, you worked for many years at the University of Hull as the head of English.
Yeah, no, I had 26 years in Hull, and I really...
So you're an honorary Hull lad as well?
Yeah, no, I really liked Hull. I really enjoyed living in Hull, and I would never have left except that my wife got a job in the south. Yeah. And for 3 years I was commuting between Hull and Surrey, which wasn't good fun, really. And so I was just looking for jobs a bit nearer, her place of work. And so I ended up with actually what suited me very well, actually, as a job as head of English it was head of English and media, really, at Anglia Ruskin in 2004. And one of my colleagues there, she wasn't there when I first joined, but she joined. Two colleagues joined subsequently with quite good interest in science fiction. So I don't know whether you've come across Professor Sarah Brown's fairly recent book on Shakespeare and science fiction.
No, I haven't.
Highly recommend that. And my other colleague, Jeanette Baxter, is a sort of expert on J.G. Ballard, and I co-edited a collection of essays on Ballard with her.
You see, you have these things under your nose, don't you? What years were you in Hull?
1978 to 2004.
Wow. So quite apart from anything else, I went to university for about 6 months and dropped out because I was just a ridiculous stoner. I couldn't get anything done. But you have these things and these expertise and these interests right under your nose, and you just don't realise it, do you? Favourite pub in Hull?
My favourite pub in Hull? Well, the one I used to go to just because it was convenient was the Queen's, but we didn't necessarily think it was a great pub, but it was actually...
That's fair.
The landlord was quite a sort of surly at times. And,
it was in those days, yeah.
But I used to live in Ella Street and then after that in Salisbury Street, so it was kind of quite handy for me, the Queen's.
The crazy thing about this is we will have been in that pub at the same time multiple times. This is how small a world it is, because I lived on off Spring Bank, down a street called Peel Street, and I had friends. I grew up down Park Avenue, just round the corner. Salisbury Street was 75 yards from our house. And I still have friends who live down Ella Street. So that was my stomping ground. We moved out of town, moved to a village, but when I came back, I went straight back to that area. So all of those pubs in that area, and by the time... But everybody's going to find this really fucking boring, aren't they, me and you talking about Hull pubs? But you know what? This is what we end up doing on this podcast, digressions. And we do have some listeners who went to Hull University as well, so at least they'll find this interesting. But, of course, by that point, Linnet and Lark will have opened up on Prince's Avenue. Yeah. Oh, yeah. We used to go in St John's, Queen's, all those places. Yeah.
One thing I'd like to mention is that I had a couple of students at Hull University who went on to become quite well-known science fiction critics. So Roger Luckhurst was a student of ours, and then Andrew Butler as well.
I had no idea Roger Luckhurst went to Hull University.
Yeah.
And you don't know, do you? If you don't know, you don't know.
Andrew Butler as well. So I supervised Andrew Butler's PhD on Philip K. Dick, and I examined Roger Luckhurst's PhD on J.G. Ballard.
Wow, fantastic. The only times I ever really set a foot on Hull University grounds after dropping out was beer festivals. that was the only times I ever went back, really. Oh, dear. What a small world. Incredibly small world. Funny enough, on that film, I rewatched Jubilee not so long ago, again, the Derek Jarman film, which is a marvellous film because I was on a Jenny Runeker kick after watching the final programme again, because she's in the final programme, isn't she? The movie of the final programme. And she's absolutely terrific in Jubilee. And of course, one of your other research interests is religion and literature. So in a way, it does seem kind of logical that you would end up writing the critical analysis, The Imitation of Christ, Michael Moorcock's Behold the Man, for Mosaic in 2019. What drove you to examine Behold the Man so closely?
Well, I think I was basically wanting to write about it for decades, actually. But I have got a habit of marinating certain things that are important to me, not sort of rushing to do anything about it immediately. But, they're there inside marinating or germinating or whatever metaphor you want to use. And I always intended to write about it, but I ended up, it was almost 40 or 50 years after I'd read it that I finally got to write about it. But I suppose in between that time, I had taught it for a number of years. And I do find that when you're teaching texts, you get the feedback from the students and what they like and what they don't like. And that basically helps you, form your ideas. So I've never seen research as kind of completely distinct from the teaching process. You always are getting ideas when you're teaching and discussing books. I have to say that it went down pretty well with most students. I also have to say that even before all this stuff about trigger warnings came up, you're supposed to be wary of upsetting students. I did feel it necessary to actually say, well, it is actually blasphemous, this book. If you are a certain kind of Christian, you just need to be aware of that. And because, it's easy to sort of, in a sense, forget how shocking it is. But I have lent it to people who are quite strong Christians, and they were quite shocked by it, even if they thought it was good. It was painful and difficult for them to read.
Yeah. Did you ever get any blowback off any students in terms of suggesting this is reading?
Not really. As I say,
because it's quite spicy in places, isn't it?
Yeah. I think most students are okay about explicit sex. They're perhaps not quite so okay about some other things, but I don't remember anyone. It's one of the very few things I did do a trigger warning for. The other thing I did was when I screened Crash. I actually did say, look, this is quite extreme stuff. So if you've got a problem with this, just don't come to the screening. I don't want you to report me to the the authorities for upsetting you too much.
Yeah. I mean, how do you do a warning for Crash? I mean, you can't come out and say contains wound fucking, can you? You've got to be a little bit more subtle than that, I suppose.
Well, basically the sexual excitement derived from car crashes. That's probably enough to put most people off.
Yeah, so you mentioned that Behold the Man was first published as a novella, and of course that was 1966, so 60 years ago. 60 years!
Yeah, 60 years ago. It's hard to believe, isn't it?
Oh, crazy. And so Moorcock's 26 when he's writing this. He's already the editor of New Worlds, and I think your article actually lists the other stories that were in that issue of New Worlds. One of them was the Atrocity exhibition.
Yeah.
There was some Tom Dish in there, I think, as well. What an issue that was. Yeah. Oh, what a... Lift that up again. Now, of course, podcast is an audio medium, but we end up doing this a lot, which is admiring covers. Oh, that's gorgeous. Yeah. So Rowley was just holding up the 60s New Worlds cover with the three crucifixes on the blue background, and other crucifixes like sort of semi-telegraph poles as well.
Yeah. As I point out, actually, in the article, in fact, the cover is a bit misleading because he's described by Moorcock as being crucified alone.
Of course.
Not in the presence of two thieves.
Yeah. Interesting. It's almost impossible to have a conversation about Behold the Man without going into spoilers, isn't it? But you know what? We spoil every book we talk about because sometimes we go into the far end of a fart about these things anyway. And it's not uncommon for us to do 3.5 hour long podcasts on a book that it only takes 2 hours to read. So we are where we are. But he's writing this at the age of 26. He's already the editor of New Worlds. He expands it to novel length in 69. Interestingly, the novella I think Moorcock described it to Colin Greenland as his favoured version of it, but certainly the novel is much better known, and I think in your critique, you argue that the novel is in fact probably more successful in its aims.
I think the novel is actually more ambitious and better, but I know there's an argument that, Moorcock himself said that he almost liked the short version and only expanded it for commercial reasons. I mean, I think that's a bit disingenuous, actually. I mean, I think he did a brilliant job expanding it, and it's more experimental, it's more extreme, but it's still completely coherent overall, even though it seems quite fragmented on the page, almost literally sometimes with typographical breakdowns and so on. But I would definitely think that the longer version is the more interesting, actually.
And for anybody who likes that type of thing, more boobs, more masturbation in the novel. He's written this in his so he's 26 when he's written the novella. He's 29 or thereabouts when he's expanded the novel. And it feels very much like a reaction to the contemporary Christianity that all kids of his age would have been blanketed in. If not at home, then certainly at school. And Colin Greenland described Behold the Man in the Entropy exhibition as a brutal, noisy and poignant vivisection of the hero victim, which is a pretty good description.
Yes, and it obviously raises questions about how far there are elements of autobiography in it, because it reads as an extremely personal work to me. And obviously Moorcock has distanced himself to some extent from the character of Carl Glogauer, and no doubt he is distant from him in some ways, but nevertheless, you do have a feeling of somebody mining something within themselves in a way that you don't necessarily quite in some of Moorcock's other work. This really does seem to be digging out painful stuff.
Yeah, I think Glogauer's definitely got strong similarities with Mike. He's roughly the same age. He's a toddler during the Blitz. He experiences the departure of his father at a young age. Mike's never written an autobiography unless you count The Whispering Swarm. Those sort of fantastical elements of autobiography in there. But you do get the sense that some of his characters are definitely projections, and Glogauer is a prime example, isn't he? I mean, Moorcock states himself that his upbringing was secular, and the closest he got to the church was throwing stink bombs through the windows. But in every other respect, Christianity was ever present, particularly when he was at school. And I think Glogauer and Elric are two sides of the coin. If Elric was emo teenage Mike, then Glogauer is definitely religio-curious, heavy masturbator Mike. Definitely more so in the expanded novel. Anyway, but you mentioned some of those lovely experiments that he does as well with text, and he did the same thing in The Black Corridor, and I have read at least one edition of Behold the Man where all that gets screwed up in the formatting of the paperback, which is a shame. But the one I have got, which I was looking at the other day, funny enough, you had your copy of the novella. I've got the 30th anniversary edition by Mojo Press, which is quite nice, and it's got a decent afterword in there by Moorcock himself when he talks about a lot of these things. So yeah, absolutely right. There's definitely a lot of Mike's own angst, anxieties, and predilections in there, I think.
I mean, I got a strong sense that the character Glogauer is extremely distrustful of rationalistic scientific explanations of everything, and this is like quite a big thread in science fiction. That you actually obviously you deal with scientific attitudes, a scientific worldview, scientific developments, technological developments, but they're usually characters who are not buying into this world in a sense, who want something else, something different, and you could vaguely call it spiritual if you want, but there's it's often not at all conventional in religious thinking, but it's searching for something that is not answered by science. Science is not the answer to everything. And I suppose this is what I'm been interested in, what I've been trying to develop. I mean, for decades now, I've been planning to write a book on science fiction and religion. And this would be one of the chapters of it. And there'll probably be about 10 other chapters. And this whole tension within so many science fiction novels between a kind of materialist worldview and something else, which might be conventional Christianity, or it might be something vaguer and more diffuse, but something which is not satisfied by a materialist scientific worldview. And I think Moorcock has said that, like Glogau, he was annoyed by a kind of sort of dogmatic, rationalist, materialist, scientific viewpoint, and I guess without actually necessarily having a great faith or confidence in a specific alternative, but just a kind of dissatisfaction with that particular orthodoxy.
I think like a lot of Mike's the SF angles in this are kind of incidental in some ways. Obviously, you've got the core conceit that a man falls out of a time machine in Palestine in AD 29, and that's our setup for the story. I think it's not the only stories we've ever had about time travellers going back to the time of Jesus Christ either, is it? I think you actually reference, is it the Robert Silverberg one?
Yes, where he develops this paradox about how, if in fact, time travellers are always going back to the time of Jesus, since there's sort of, hundreds and hundreds of years involved, then there'll be more and more time travellers as the years go past, all arrive at the same spot at the same time. And that's actually a rather good refutation of the idea that there could be anything so straightforward as that kind of time travel, because, yes, you'd have coach loads of people. And that's what that story, Let's Go to Golgotha, is about, where the protagonist realises that almost all the other people there are actually time travellers. There aren't any natives there.
Yeah, it's a lovely image, isn't it, that you go to the Sermon on the Mount, and everybody there is a time traveller who's gone to watch the Sermon on the Mount, which gives you that lovely circular idea that without the time travellers, would anybody been watching or listening? It's a great idea, but like the best Moorcock SF, again, for want of a better expression or tag, it's less about the technology and more about the tension between what the technology makes possible or provides and what we as human beings tend to do in terms of like human movements like religion or like, the battle with our own ethics and morality. And I think Behold the Man is a really excellent example of that, but particularly because it's through the cracked prism of a guy who is really psychologically fucked up, which makes it all the more interesting all over again.
Yeah, I mean, it makes me wonder why I engage so much with this particular story, I suppose. I suppose if I was about 20 when I first read it, I could say, well, I was, anxious about relationships, still developing a sense of identity, and so on and so on and so on. But that is the case with all teenagers, more or less, and people into their 20s. I think it's not just neurotic male teenagers who fixate a bit on this story. I mean, my wife lent it to a friend of hers who's a successful career woman, middle-aged, successful career woman, very well organised and, effective. And she really engaged with it, I mean, so I guess it taps into insecurities any person at any age or gender might feel about who they are and how they relate to other people. I really liked this whole problem that he develops in the book about other people sort of almost eroding your identity because you're trying to please them. You're trying to be one person with your girlfriend, another person with your mates in the pub, another person with your boss. You're actually there's no core identity really, because you're ape. I think aping is the word he uses. You're trying to please and trying to imitate the whole time. And where is the real you? Obviously, I became interested in all this Jungian stuff, which is foregrounded in the novel about the search for the sort of authentic self. What is the real you, and how that gets mixed up with the search for Jesus, because Jesus is an archetype of the self in Jungian psychology. I thought that was all quite powerful. And as you know, that there's a very important quotation from Jung at the heart of Behold the Man, where he asks, what does the imitation of Christ really mean, basically? Does it mean doing the sort of things Christ did, going around healing the sick, preaching the kingdom to come, getting yourself crucified after overturning the money changers' tables, things like that? Does it mean doing what he did? Or does it mean actually living your own life as fully, as truly, as authentically as Jesus lived his? And Jung says, and I think this really stuck with me even when I was first read it at the age of 20, that he says basically it's really difficult to live your own life. It's really difficult to imitate Christ. That's difficult. But it's even more difficult to live your own life truly and authentically. And that's really what the novel is about, with this kind of paradox at the heart of it, that it is the protagonist, in a sense, evading his problems by becoming Jesus, or is Jesus somehow the symbol of the centered self, which he has finally authentically reached and encountered. And I don't think you can really decide it one way or the other. Either becoming Jesus is a kind of neurotic escape from his real world problems with his girlfriend and so on.
Yeah.
Or it is actually, he has, plumbed the depths of his authentic self.
Yeah. I love the juxtaposition of, because of course, for listeners perhaps who haven't read this, Karl Glogauer, this time traveller, is a sort of regretful, mopey guy at first, but one who, whilst being carried on a litter from this cracked, milky globe that comprised the time machine, reflects on his childhood, his troubled times in which he learned histrionic behaviour patterns from his mother, who might have been banging the lodger. We don't really know. It's kind of hinted at, and eventually grows into this adventure in the role which he ends up adopting. Of course, it's hard to talk about this book without spoilers, and you've just alluded to the fact that, referred directly to the fact that, he will get crucified, effectively in Christ's place. But when I pulled a paperback off the shelf a couple of days ago to give this a read again, I pulled the Fantasy Masterworks version of the Gollancz Fantasy Masterworks collection. And, there is one paragraph on the back which gives you an idea of what's going on in the book. And, it does kind of spoil things a little bit, because the paragraph reads as follows. It says, meet Karl Glogauer, time traveller and unlikely messiah. When he finds himself in Palestine in the year 29 AD, he is shocked to meet the man known as Jesus Christ, a drooling idiot hiding in the shadows of the carpenter's shop in Nazareth. But if he is not capable of fulfilling his historical role, then who will take his place? It's like, holy crap, Gollancz. Throw the book away in one paragraph,
Yeah, that does give away too much.
It really does. I mean, at least on this podcast, we usually chat you up a bit before we spoil it. But back of the book, bang, no foreplay. It just blurts the money shot straight into your eyes. Very cheap, Gollancz. But yeah, I mean, this stuff is important though, isn't it? Because in your paper, you make a point about demagogy and Jesus being the creation of the needs of the people. And there's a quote that says, though they thought he led them, they in fact drove him before them. An idea I think that's brilliantly explored and exploited probably in The Life of Brian a few years later. Maybe actually more successfully too. But you do make the point that this thrust of the demagogy theme does fade, and the personal journey and psychological neediness of Glogauer becomes the main narrative thrust as he inevitably heads to the cross.
Yeah, if Moorcock started off with the idea that it was all about followers sort of creating their leader, I think he abandoned that quite quickly, actually, and it became much more a kind of psychic excavation of this neurotic, but to me, sympathetic character.
The entire idea about Christianity and how it fits and how demagogues emerge. And in his afterword to the 30th anniversary edition, Moorcock talks a lot about this. And, he talks about growing up in the ruins of the war and how the church didn't really challenge effectively, acts of war and acts of violence and things like, the Germans having God is with us on their belt buckles and the Pope not effectively challenging and everything else. But he writes some really interesting things. He says, both Mussolini and Hitler took over nations with near perfect democratic constitutions separating church and state. They tore up those constitutions and united church and state, and for this they received considerable credit from Christian leaders. As an enthusiastic believer in the principles of our common democracy, I cannot help mourning the fact that the USA is presently the most exploited, misinformed and badly educated modern state amongst her democratic peers. Notoriously, she has the worst news media, poorly informed people are easily manipulated and convinced to act against their own self-interests. Too few modern Americans understand their own history or the principles of their nation's robust political system. There was a good reason why the leaders of the American Revolution, fired by the ideas of the Enlightenment, built those principles into the Constitution. Those American radicals were the noblest successors of progressive British politicians, many of whom supported the American Revolution, who had already made their country the most democratic in the world. They were well aware of the pervasive support and maintenance of corrupt authority endemic in the unification of church and state, and how much this had contributed to injustice and tyranny in Europe. They were determined not to let that particular phenomenon occur in the New World and, in their eloquent Bill of Rights, established a principle designed to prevent it. It is perhaps ironic that church and state have never been closer in modern America, and that the repressive power of the church is now exactly what America's founders sought to escape and avoid. Modern international corporatism may well have challenged those principles, but as fiercely as it is currently assaulting the last bastions of our public power, it is yet to get the better of them. 30 years ago he wrote that.
Yeah, it's been a paradox for a long time that you have a formal separation of church and state in America, but actually religion dominates politics in a way that it simply does not in the UK. The UK actually does have an established church, and apparently it's the only country apart from Iran to actually have clerics in its legislature by default. But nevertheless, Britain is a pretty secular country in lots of ways, and there's just no way that religion infuses politics in the way that it does in America. So somehow the constitutional separation didn't really work, I suppose.
I mean, it's very critical of the state of discourse around faith and the power of religion in relation to the state and its undue influence. He wrote that in 1996. And of course, he's living in Texas now, 30 years later. I'm sure he's got some thoughts and ideas about how prescient all that stuff was. And here we are another 30 years later, 60 years after that novella was published in New Worlds. And all you can really say is blimey. Although I suppose a couple of interesting points there. One is, we now live in a time where the Pope has just condemned people who pray to God and Jesus who are engaged in the waging of war, which is a fascinating set of events.
Well, both this Pope and his predecessor were actually more left-wing than most world leaders, actually in a lot of their pronouncements.
I suppose one of the interesting things about the ecclesiarchy, is that the right expression, the ecclesiarchy in the UK, sitting in the House of Lords, if we ignore their own institutional problems and failings, of which there have been many, in the Lords, they are often actually some of the more left-wing leaning challengers of law and legislation in our current system of government as well.
This goes back to the 1980s, where I remember people saying that Church of England was one of the more effective voices of opposition to Thatcher. Most church people I know are definitely left of centre rather than pillars of the establishment.
Yeah, it's a peculiar... You know what? An absolutely fascinating thing about this podcast is the first year we were going, we started in September, our first episode went out in September, and then shortly afterwards we learned that Michael Moorcock's birthday was the same as my wife's, 18th of December, and my wife appears on the podcast. So on the 18th of December that year, we went to Whitby, and we recorded a podcast in Whitby, and I put it out the same evening. And why did I mention December? What were we talking about? I'll have to edit this out, won't I?
You triggered by the fact that Michael Moorcock had the same birthday as your wife. Perhaps you're going to make some important point about that. But,
Oh, that's right. One of the things I pre-recorded for that episode was that a guy who'd latched onto the podcast quite quickly, and because I was on Twitter in those days, no longer on Twitter, of course, but at the time, Twitter was quite a nice place to have conversations and discourse. We have Blue Sky, who's replaced that now, so we're all right. But there was a guy on Twitter called Jason, and I was fascinated to talk to him about his love of Moorcock. Massive, hardcore Moorcock nerd, a little bit younger than me, but also a right-wing conservative Christian pastor and Trump supporter.
Oh, God.
Yeah. Weird, right? So I had him on the podcast, and we just recorded for half an hour, and I slung it in there. And Behold the Man is one of his favourite books. So it's a weird thing to think that in our country, perhaps it's a completely different scenario Christianity as an establishment is very, very different, I think, in the UK to how it is largely in the USA. There may be similarities in the big cities with certain denominations, but certainly... And Jason, if you're listening, by the way, hello. We haven't spoke for a while. And having that conversation with him was absolutely fascinating, and talking to him briefly about the Behold the Man was fascinating because he didn't find it offensive or blasphemous. But I get the sense that, I don't know, 6.5 years later with Trump in his second term, the kind of Christian conservatives that are still pro-Trump now, if you showed them a copy of Behold the Man, I'm not sure how that would go down.
I've never been quite clear why Michael Moorcock moved to Texas when he'd apparently had death threats from Texas about Behold the Man.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. So, that's quite fascinating, isn't it? Because I think he still splits his time between France and Texas, with occasional stays back in the UK. But as far as I'm aware, he's been in Texas now for probably almost 2 years. I think because his health precludes him travelling back and forth as much as he used to. I mean, I don't know, he could be in Paris. But yeah, it does seem kind of strange. But then, of course, Texas itself, there's a big dichotomy in Texas as well between liberal left-leaning Texas and hardcore right-wing God-fearing Texas.
Well, there's Austin, Texas, where the university is, and I got the impression that was a kind of a bit of an island of left liberal thought in a sea of, I don't know what you call them, right-wing libertarians or...
That's always been an impression that I've got, and I mean, I don't think it's quite the same anymore, because at one point the Austin comedy scene was a hotbed of left-leaning, what we would understand as liberal comedy. I do get a little bit confused by how the USA uses terminology in relation to politics when it comes to liberal and libertarian and all those bits and pieces. But of course, the Austin comedy scene has been absolutely flattened now by the Joe Rogan manosphere of comedians as well. So I don't think the Austin comedy scene is quite what it was 10 years ago. But yeah, it's very, very strange. But yeah, so prescient as ever, here we are 30 years later after he wrote that, and good Lord, what a crazy mess it all is. But I suppose it's as messy as Glogauer's own journey, isn't it? Because Glogauer undertakes his journey, gets quite into the idea of hanging out with the Essenes and having a big beard and shaggy hair, and then, ends up taking on the role, gets on the cross, crucified alone, no thief on either side of him, and says it's a lie.
He's described as having a death wish, and you wonder whether Moorcock went to Texas. There was some sort of...
Well, maybe so. Maybe Moorcock had to find out whether it was a lie. Because that's one of the beautiful things about the end of the book is you can read that in a whole host of different ways. But that Jungian question of what is it like to live like Christ, Glogauer definitely went with the option of cure blind old ladies and get crucified. And then while he's dying on the cross, he repeats, "It's a lie, it's a lie, it's a lie."
So obviously, on one reading, he'd have been better off trying to make it up with his girlfriend and trying to deal with an adult relationship.
Yeah. Well, his girlfriend, is it Miriam? His girlfriend,
Monica. Who was
the most sensible and funniest person in the book.
It's actually the name of St. Augustine's mother. I wonder whether that was deliberate or not.
Probably, knowing Mike. And of course, she's an analogue for Hilary Bailey as well, isn't she? Who, if you used to follow that through naturally, she just probably got fed up with his shit by the turn of the 70s.
I think in the article I mentioned that Moorcock himself said he didn't like Behold the Man because it had no humour in it. Yeah. I actually said, well, I don't think that's quite fair because, and then I quoted this bit where he goes, Monica, I've got a lack of something, or more, a lack of a lack, maybe.
Yeah.
You see, oh, God, for God's sake.
That's right. It's a funny thing because, I said earlier that Elric and Glogauer are like two sides of a coin. Often, good Lord, I've got hailstones hammering against the window. That will probably pick up on the microphone. Sudden hailstorm. How bizarre. It's almost April and we've got a hailstorm. There's this wonderful thing where I think it's down to the reader to identify Elric as a bit of a Burke, But in Behold the Man, Monica, he's out and out thinks he's a complete Burke, which is kind of wonderful. Yeah,
so the novel has got layers of irony as well as simply straightforward, raw pain in it.
You know what? I think Behold the Man is something that, I first read it probably 40 years ago, and I've read it probably every 6 or 7 years since, and it certainly doesn't get stale in any way. And
No.
like Moorcock's best writing, you can pick up something different from it every time you read it.
Well, that's right. I mean, I must have taught it on and off for about 20 years. I mean, not every year, but most times when I ran a science fiction module, I included it as one of the texts, and it didn't go stale with me, and it always worked well as a discussion text with students.
You know what, really? I did GCSE English and I did A-level English. I got my A-level in English in 1990, and I deeply regret not going to do English at Hull University, because, trust me, had I been on your course and one day you rocked up and said, we're going to talk about Behold the Man, my fucking brain would have exploded. I would have been ecstatic. Absolutely ecstatic.
Yeah. I mean, I think Andrew Butler arrived at Hull in, I think it was 1988, and it was only just at that point that I was actually first introducing some science fiction into the curriculum, because we had a chance to mess with the syllabus a bit. I mean, I think most of my colleagues were not really into science fiction at all, but they were okay about me teaching some of it. They didn't sort of... they trusted me enough, you know, to know that I'd be doing something that was quite good. And but I had to, over the years, you know, I sort of juggled about a bit with which texts I would use, because it's quite odd that some texts seem to work in class and some don't. And I would say Behold the Man always did work. Whereas I tried various Brian Aldiss texts and they never seemed to go down all that well, even though I thought they were good.
That's the interesting thing about Moorcock, the way he writes and the way you can read him. No matter how challenging the content, it's super digestible. I don't know why, because he's a good writer, probably, but it's 10-page digestible good time when you read a Moorcock book. You know, even some of the ones that are perhaps, you know, slightly less appealing than is more interesting and challenging stuff, it's still always an easy reading good time.
This is written in a very different way to a lot of his books, isn't it? I mean, it's this fragmented sort of montage effect, you know, where it just jumps from one bit to another, just, you know, across different time spans and between the Palestine and
I mean, it is, but it's not the English Assassin level of challenging, you know?
No.
It's the narrative works, it jumps around, but, I mean, the first chapter in the novel, I think it's 6 pages long, and the amount that he establishes in those 6 pages is phenomenal, and there's not many writers who can do it in such a short page and word count. And, you know, we've always applied that praise to his things like his battle scenes and how vivid and evocative they are. But that actually applies to just about everything he does and everything he writes. You know, just the account of his mother being upstairs with the lodger and faking the faint on the stairs to avoid having to have a difficult conversation with her son. It's written just as effectively and efficiently and in such an illuminatory way in terms of actually getting his point across as any of his pure fantasy stuff. It's just a terrific skill as a writer, I think, even when he's knocking this stuff out at an absolutely insane pace.
It's a very slim book, actually, isn't it? It has an immense amount in it for its size.
Yeah, I mean, if you tell somebody, oh, this is the expanded version.
Yeah,
it's remarkable. And of course, Glogau might get crucified at the end and is definitively dead because there's a reference to the rotting corpse. He does come back in Breakfast in the Ruins because, of course, Moorcock, anything's possible.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I think that was a rather sort of casual and opportunistic use of the character name. It didn't seem to really have much relation to Behold the Man.
We're going to have to get to doing that at some point, but in a podcast called Breakfast in the Ruins, that's going to have to be episode 300 special or something, I think, or something like that. So have you got anything else up your sleeve that you've been burning to write about for the last 50 years?
Well, as I say, I've only recently actually gone back to this project of writing this book on science fiction and religion, and last year I wrote a couple of chapters, one on Stanislav Lem's Solaris and the film that Tarkovsky made of it. And the other one on Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents. And I'm halfway through reworking some stuff I wrote on Mary Doria Russell a few years ago, and I'm going to have a chapter on her 2 Rakat novels, and then basically it's a question of what else I'm going to include, and I'm going to have to do a Philip K. Dick chapter, and I'm going to have to do an Orson Scott Card chapter, I think, a Dan Simmons chapter. I've got various possibilities because I have a fairly loose definition of what counts as religion and what counts as an engagement with religion in science fiction. I don't know whether you know all these things, but Orson Scott Card's Speaker for the Dead is a really interesting book as part of the Ender series.
Yeah, I read Ender's Game and Speaker for the Dead. I got those off Pops. Probably read them in my teens. I've not read them since. But you know, I remember enjoying Game, but Speaker of the Dead was a much more
heavyweight work.
Yeah, much more complex piece of work. Yeah. Of course, I mean, Orson Scott Card's got his reputation's been a little bit tanked, but he was a good writer, wasn't he? It's funny you mention the Tarkovsky Solaris as well.
That's possibly my all-time favourite film, Tarkovsky Solaris. I mean,
I love Solaris, and I adore
about 10 times, I think, and
I adore Stalker, but I have a problem in this house.
Well. Yeah,
I have a problem in this house in that I made my wife. I didn't make it. My wife watched Solaris with me.
Yeah,
and at the end, she just looked at me and was like, "What? What have you just made me watch?" She hated it. Absolutely hated it. And then a couple of years later, I got the Criterion Blu-ray of Stalker. And I was like, right. Normally, what I say to Phil is I say, right, do you want to watch a film? And she'll say, oh, yeah. Well, what do you want to watch? Oh, well, you choose. And then I say, Hard to Be a God. She goes, fuck off. Because she got halfway through Hard to Be a God with me, and she was like, I'm not watching any more of this. Yeah. It's just people and shit.
No, I've watched that in the cinema, and I've also got the Blu-ray of it as well.
It's wonderful.
Many people who can sit through it all, but I actually found it quite compelling. I mean, given that it's basically just medieval squalor and blood and gore, it was actually quite compelling. And
I couldn't take my eyes off it.
Yeah,
every single frame of that film is a work of art. You know, the extras that he got, just the background players, every single face is the most interesting face you've ever seen on film. Just the background players, the amount of detail in the costumery, the cinematography. I mean, you know, having people basically upside down in privies in a muddy area outside a castle wall doesn't sound like it should look like a work of art. But I think he was his own cinematographer as well, wasn't he?
I think so. Yeah.
The lighting, the cinematography, the black and white film stock that he used, it's just an astonishing piece of work. But not Phil's cup of tea.
Have you read the novel as well?
No, I haven't.
The novel is tonally quite a lot different. The novel is much lighter. And I mean, it is basically the film is following the plot of the novel, but the novel is much lighter in tone than the film. Sure.
Yeah, I only read Roadside Picnic for the first time. For listeners, that's what Stalker was based on.
Yeah,
I only read Roadside Picnic for the first time because I was invited on another podcast, and I went on another podcast and read Roadside Picnic purely for that purpose, and got to watch Stalker again. Phil wouldn't watch it with me, so I got to watch Stalker on my own. I was really, really surprised because what Tarkovsky does with Stalker compared to the book, you know, it's there's about 20% of the book in there, and he's turned it into the most unbelievably bleak and meditative like piece of art. Yeah. It's absolutely terrific, but it doesn't really bear that much resemblance with the book. You know?
No.
Oh well, we've talked about Behold the Man. We've talked about some of your other interests. I also know that you did a paper on John Dee, and I can't remember, what was the title of it? John Dee.
Oh yeah. What was the title? John Dee as a cultural hero, wasn't it?
Yeah. Now, I tried to find a link to that, and I couldn't find a link to it. I would love to read that.
I can send you the PDF of that. Yeah,
that'd be fantastic.
That was co-written with my Hungarian friend George Cerny, who is a real expert on John Dee. Whereas I'm not. So he did the kind of the proper kind of historical stuff on John Dee, whereas I did the sort of like the modern film and television and other kind of uses of John Dee.
Yeah.
But put together, it's actually quite a comprehensive essay. Actually, it does.
Yeah. I'd love to read that because, the first time I ever became aware of John Dee was purely through fiction, because in the Call of Cthulhu role-playing game, the English translation of the Necronomicon was done by John Dee. I was like, oh, was this done John Dee? Turns out, oh, he's a real character. But John Dee seems to be having some kind of renaissance in fiction, because in the last few years there's been a role-playing game called the Dee Sanction, where the players play agents of John Dee. And one of my semi-regular co-hosts, author Andy Darby, just recently released a novel, an adventure novel, historical adventure novel, in which John Dee is one of the characters. So, yeah, it'd be really fascinating to read that.
After we'd finished the article, but before it got published, there was an opera based on John Dee, and we managed to fit in a coda to the article covering this opera, which was actually quite a powerful opera.
Just before we go, just tell me about the Centre for Science Fiction and Fantasy that you remember of.
Well, it's not really very active at the moment, I think. It's a kind of umbrella for various activities. There was a time when Farah Mendelssohn was here at Anglia Ruskin, and she was involved with it. At the moment, I think my colleague Sarah Brown is probably the most important person connected with the centre. But it's sort of, I would say, it operates in a rather spasmodic way, in that, if there's some event or talk, it'll advertise that and so on. But I don't think there's been a massive amount going on recently. Like a lot of these things, you build a kind of structure and then you fill it, and then some people move on, and the structure's still there. And it depends on individual interests, what PhD students you have around at that time, for instance, what research is going on in that area. Jeanette Baxter will be involved in it as well.
So compared to when you were teaching Behold the Man in the early 90s and today, 2026, has the interest for students of English in science fiction waxed or waned?
I would say I think it's been fairly consistent over the decades I taught it, actually, in that for most students now, science fiction means film and television. And I found that very few students, obviously there were major exceptions like Andrew Butler, for instance, who was far better read than I was. But on the whole, most students have not really read science fiction. For them, it's a film and television phenomenon, or a game, even a game. Phenomenon. So I always had to make clear at the start of my module that there's no Star Wars, there's no Star Trek, there's no Doctor Who. This is actually a literature module. But then, having said that, I would say that most of them did appreciate the books that I covered. And I said there was a certain amount of trial and error to find which ones worked. And then when I found ones which I thought worked, I tended to stick with them rather than having new books every year. I can tell you which ones I think always worked, basically. Arthur C. Clarke's Childhood's End, that always worked. And I think it's a great book. Ursula Le Guin's The Dispossessed, that's another really great book. Philip K. Dick's Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep is what I used to do, but other Philip Dick ones would work as well, I think.
I used to recommend Ubik to my girlfriends. I used to get them to try and read Ubik or Dimension of Miracles by Robert Sheckley. It was like a litmus test.
And I've done Neuromancer, that worked reasonably well. And I've done some ballad. I mean, my favourite ballad novel is probably The Crystal World, but that's sort of it's all kind of image rather than plot in a way. It's but it's quite a haunting experience to read.
I wish I'd joined one of your courses back in the day. I would have absolutely loved it.
And also, what I always used to say is actually the short story is in many ways, the key science fiction form, what used to be anyway. And I always did plenty of short stories. Something I haven't mentioned yet, actually. I'm quite lucky to have become friends with someone in Cambridge who's a very good science fiction writer. Have you read any of Chris Beckett's novels? Well, I can highly recommend those. The most famous ones are probably the Dark Eden trilogy. So
I'll look them up.
Dark Eden won the Arthur C. Clarke Award.
Yeah.
His first novel I really liked, The Holy Machine, basically I've read all his work and it's all good. And he was a social work lecturer at Anglia Ruskin when I arrived, and I became friendly with him, and I actually included stories by him on the module I taught, and he was obviously very pleased about that, to be taught alongside Philip K. Dick and Arthur C. Clarke and Ursula Le Guin. But they're good, and the students like them, and they like the fact that he would come in and talk about his work to them, so they actually got to see a genuinely good SF writer in the flesh.
Fabulous. Oh yeah, I'll definitely look that up. Remind me what the name of your son's podcast was again. I'm going to type it so I don't forget it.
The Tiny Bookcase.
Smashing.
It's my nephew's.
Nephew, yeah.
Nephew podcast.
Yeah. One final question before we sign off. Patty Butty, yes or no?
Probably no.
Oh, so disappointing. Even after a few jars. Oh, you know, Hull man. You know, true Hull man. Well, you know what? It's been brilliant talking to you, Rowley. Thanks so much for taking the time.
And, thanks. It's nice to talk to someone who's actually so well informed about Moorcock and SF. And
you know what? You're welcome back absolutely any time. But in the meantime, take care. We'll maybe talk to you again soon.
Cheers then. Thanks, Andy.
Many thanks to Rowley for taking the time to drop by Derry Toms and talk about Behold the Man. I'll link to his article in the show notes, and it would be amazing to talk to him again, particularly if we finally get to covering some Ballard, Le Guin, Philip K. Dick, or any of those other great authors we talked about. I mentioned a podcast that I was invited on to talk about Roadside Picnic and Stalker, and that was, of course, Ralph Lovegrove's excellent Fictoplasm Podcast. I'll link to that in the show notes too. We'll be back at some point in the future to follow up on this first look at Behold the Man, because this year is, of course, the 60th anniversary of its first appearance in New Worlds, in novella form, of course. And I've got the comic adaptation kicking around somewhere too. We'll get to it. But in the meantime, thanks as ever to our glorious patrons. First, those without tier: Anthony Piconti, Tim Cardos, Dave Dempster, and Sebastian Weetabix. And to our chaos engineers: Andrew Clark, Andrew Cicluna, Andrew Spong, Anthony Porter, Benjamin Fletcher, Ben Hagar, Brandon Mays, Dan Charnley, Dave F., Dave Griffiths, Dave Voxman, Gabriel Laycock, Harvey Faulkner-Aston, Jim Kirkland, Jim Jupp, John W. Lays, Jules Lawrence, Mal Pertwee, Matt Saltz, Michael Hopwood, Paul McRandall, PJ Cooper, Rex Osius Nusquam, Roger McCarthy, Scott Butler, Simon Perrins, Steve Braun, and Steve Luke. And thanks, of course, to our crafty Jugaderos, Ed von Stort, Adrian Tchaikovsky, Alexander Harris, Andrew Van Ness, Kathy Rhubarb, Chris Sharp, Christian Hundal, James Connell, Graham Holden, James Knight, Kevin Williams, Liam Turner, Lorne Hugo, Loz, Mark Buckley, Mark Hewlett, Mark Taylor, Matthew Broom, Murray Palmer, Arthur Ziv, Ritsby Skits, Sean Twist, Toby White, Taylor Lavery, and of course, Nick Hopkinson. Thanks for sending us the link to that article, Nick. And eternal thanks to our patron demons: Action Edmonds, Alistair Davison, Andy Darby, Brian Henderson, David Lee, Derek Clunan, Fred Quiche, Gareth Wilson, Glenn Sawyer, Greg Faulkner, Gwen Barlow, Ian Stead, Jenny Stim, Jason Vogel, Jem Gilbert, Joachim Sund, Joe Monty, Johan Hiapa, Jonathan Sharp, Lee Gary, Liam Jones, Marius Latauskas, Mark Hebden, Miles Reed-Labato, Neil Burton, Paul Hillary, Randall Gatlin, Steve Round, Tom Murphy, Tern Malazzo, the OG patron Norman Beresford, and last but never least, Robert McMillan. That's enough from me for today. You can follow us on Instagram and Blue Sky with the handle @BreakfastRuins. You can email us breakfastruins@outlook.com. The webpage is breakfastintheruins.com. We've got our Patreon page too, of course. There are a few extra odds and sods on there. But until next time, wherever you are in the world, whatever's going on in your corner of that world, take care, stay safe, duck and cover, and we will meet again soon on the Moonbeam Roads.